They said the black stallion would kill any man who tried to ride him. 30 cowboys had already fallen, bones broken, pride shattered, fortunes lost. But Eleanor Vance kept offering the challenge anyway, waiting for someone who understood what she really wanted wasn't strength, it was trust. When a scarred drifter named Caleb Rourke walked into her valley with empty pockets and haunted eyes, nobody expected him to succeed. What happened in that corral would change everything they thought they knew about broken things, and whether they could ever be whole again. If you're curious how a man with nothing left to lose found everything he'd been searching for, stay with me until the end of this story. And if you enjoy it, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this tale travels. The valley stretched wide and unforgiving beneath a sky the color of old bruises. Wind cut across the grassland in waves, bending everything in its path except the fence post that marked Eleanor Vance's property. They stood like sentinels, weathered, gray, and stubborn, same as the woman who'd driven them into the ground with her own hands after her husband died. The ranch house sat at the valley's heart, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch that had seen better years. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips. Shutters hung crooked. But the barn stood solid, rebuilt twice after fires, and the corrals were maintained with the kind of attention that spoke to priorities. This was a working ranch, not a showpiece, and Eleanor Vance ran it the way she ran everything else in her life, with grit and without apology. She stood at the fence now, one boot propped on the lowest rail, watching the black stallion that had become both her greatest asset and her biggest problem. Obsidian. The horse moved like liquid midnight across the corral, muscles rippling beneath a coat so dark it seemed to absorb light. 17 hands of pure defiance, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. He'd put 4 men in the doctor's office in Copper Ridge and sent twice that many limping home with their dignity in tatters. "You gonna let another one try?" The question came from Miguel Reyes, Eleanor's foreman and the only person whose opinion she actually valued. He'd worked the ranch for 20 years, first under her husband Daniel, then under her after Daniel's horse threw him into a ravine 3 winters back. "Why not?" Eleanor's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who'd stopped hoping for much. "Money's the same whether they succeed or fail, and they always fail. Then why keep doing it?" She didn't answer right away, just watched Obsidian wheel and kick at something only he could see. The horse had been Daniel's project, a wild Mustang he'd spent 2 years gentling, turning into something extraordinary. After Daniel died, something in Obsidian broke too. Or maybe it just stopped pretending to be something it wasn't. Because eventually, Eleanor said quietly, someone's going to understand what the challenge actually is. Miguel made a sound that might have been agreement or skepticism. Hard to tell with him. "The Morton boys here rode up about an hour ago. Says he's ready to try." "Which Morton boy?" "The middle one, James." Eleanor sighed. The Mortons owned the largest spread in the valley, and they'd been trying to absorb her land for years. First through offers that insulted her intelligence, then through social pressure, and finally through her daughter-in-law, Patricia, who'd married Eleanor's son Thomas, and spent every Sunday dinner suggesting it was time for Eleanor to retire somewhere comfortable. "He's going to fail," Eleanor said. "Probably. But his father will say I'm being unreasonable when I don't sell him the horse afterward at a discount." "Definitely." She pushed off from the fence. "Let's get this over with." The crowd that had gathered was smaller than last month's attempt, but still substantial. Word spread fast when someone challenged Obsidian. People came from 3 counties over to watch, drawn by the spectacle and the slim possibility they might witness something impossible. James Morton stood near the barn, surrounded by his brothers and a handful of ranch hands who'd clearly been brought along for moral support. He was young, maybe 23, with the kind of confidence that came from never having encountered a problem his family's money couldn't solve. Eleanor approached with Miguel a step behind. James straightened when he saw her, his smile calculated to be charming. "Mrs. Vance," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "appreciate the opportunity." "It's not an opportunity," Eleanor replied. "It's a business transaction. You fail, you pay me $50 for my time and the entertainment value. You succeed, which you won't. You get $500 in ownership of the horse." "Yes, ma'am. I understand the terms." "Do you understand the horse?" James glanced toward the corral where Obsidian paced like a caged storm. I've broken 40 horses, Mrs. Vance. I know what I'm doing. That's what they all say. She could see the moment her dismissiveness sparked his pride. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. Men like James Morton didn't hear no very often, and they certainly didn't accept it from women they considered past their prime. Whenever you're ready, Eleanor said, gesturing toward the corral. James handed his hat to one of his brothers and rolled his shoulders like a prizefighter preparing for a bout. The crowd pressed closer to the fence. Eleanor caught sight of Patricia standing near the back. Her expression caught between hope that James would succeed and Eleanor would be forced to part with the horse, and fear that he'd get hurt, and somehow that would be Eleanor's fault too. Miguel opened the gate. James stepped through with the kind of swagger that made Eleanor tired. Obsidian noticed him immediately. The stallion's head came up, ears flattening. He wheeled away, putting the maximum distance between himself and the intruder. "Easy there," James called out, his voice carrying that particular false gentleness men used when they were trying to pretend dominance was kindness. "Nobody's going to hurt you." He advanced steadily, rope in hand. Classic mistake. Obsidian didn't respond to pressure. He responded to patience. But patience required time, and men like James Morton were always in a hurry to prove something. The stallion let James get within 10 feet before exploding into motion. He charged, not to attack but to establish boundaries, and James stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Laughter rippled through the crowd. James's face flushed red. "Need a longer rope, boy," someone shouted. James ignored them, regrouping. He tried a different angle, moving with more caution now. But caution wasn't the same as understanding, and Obsidian could sense the difference. Every time James got close, the horse evaded him, making him look foolish. 20 minutes passed this way. James's confidence crumbled by degrees. Sweat darkened his shirt. Dust coated his face. The crowd's amusement curdled into something meaner, the particular satisfaction people took in watching the privileged fail. Finally, James managed to get the rope around Obsidian's neck. The stallion reared, and for a moment James held on, thinking he'd won some kind of victory. Then Obsidian came down hard, pivoted, and the rope slid free as easily as water through fingers. James stood there, chest heaving, staring at the horse with something close to hatred. "That's enough," Eleanor called out. "You tried. It didn't work." "I'm not done." "Yes, you are. I paid for my chance. And you've had it." Eleanor's voice cut through the crowd noise like a blade. "You can't rope what won't be caught, Mr. Morton, and you can't ride what doesn't trust you." James opened his mouth to argue, but his older brother, Daniel Morton, named after Eleanor's late husband in what Patricia probably thought was a touching gesture, stepped forward. "Come on, James. She's right. Let it go." The younger Morton threw the rope down in disgust and stalked out of the corral. Eleanor watched him go without sympathy. She'd seen too many like him, men who thought force was the answer to every question. $50, she reminded him as he passed. "You can settle up with Miguel." James dug into his pocket and threw the money at Miguel's feet before storming off toward his horse. His brothers followed, and the crowd began to disperse, already trading stories about what they'd witnessed. Eleanor stayed at the fence, watching Obsidian settle. The stallion shook himself, then dropped his head to crop at some grass, the entire confrontation already forgotten. "You're going to run out of fools eventually," Miguel said, picking up the bills James had scattered. "Not in this valley." "What happens when you do?" Eleanor didn't answer because she didn't know. The truth was, she hadn't expected to still be running this challenge 6 months after she'd started. She'd expected someone to understand what she was actually offering. Someone to see past the obvious challenge and recognize the deeper test. Daniel would have known, but Daniel was 3 years dead, and Eleanor was starting to think the kind of man her husband had been didn't exist anymore, if he ever had outside her memory of him. "I'm heading into Copper Ridge tomorrow," she said. "Need supplies and want to check on the Ferguson order. You'll be all right here? When am I not?" She almost smiled. Miguel was steady as stone and twice as reliable. If more men were like him, the world would be less exhausting. That night, Eleanor sat on her porch with a glass of whiskey and watched the sun sink behind the western ridge. The valley turned gold, then amber, then the deep blue of approaching dark. Somewhere out in the corral, Obsidian moved like a shadow, restless even in the cooling evening. She thought about Daniel, the way she always did when the day ended and silence filled the spaces between heartbeats. He'd brought Obsidian home 7 years ago, a wild 2-year-old colt with eyes like black fire. Everyone said he was untrainable. Daniel had smiled that quiet smile of his and said, "We'll see." It took him 18 months of patient, steady work. No ropes, no breaking, just time and attention, and the kind of understanding that couldn't be taught. By the time Obsidian turned 4, he'd become the best horse on the ranch. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but the smartest and most loyal. Then Daniel died, and Obsidian remembered what it felt like to be wild. Eleanor couldn't blame him. Some days she felt wild too, trapped in a life that kept demanding she perform a version of herself she no longer recognized. Patricia wanted her to sell the ranch and move to a little house in town. The Mortons wanted her land. The Valley wanted her to remarry and let some man take over the burden of running things. Nobody asked what Eleanor wanted. Well, she wanted someone who could ride Obsidian, not through force or trickery, but through the same patient understanding Daniel had shown. She wanted proof that kind of man still existed, that the qualities she'd loved in her husband hadn't died with him. She wanted to believe broken things could still choose to trust again. The whiskey burned warm in her chest. Stars emerged overhead, sharp and cold. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and Obsidian answered with a sound that wasn't quite a whinny, something older and stranger, the voice of wild places that remembered what freedom felt like. Eleanor raised her glass to the night and drank to impossible things. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Eleanor rode into Copper Ridge on her bay mare, taking the river road because it was prettier and she wasn't in any particular hurry. The town had grown since she was a girl, 2 saloons now instead of 1, a proper hotel, even a telegraph office. Progress, people called it, though Eleanor wasn't convinced. She handled her business at the feed store, arranged for the Ferguson delivery, and stopped by the bank to deal with some paperwork that made her head hurt and her patience thin. By the time she finished, the sun stood high and her stomach was demanding lunch. The diner sat on Main Street, wedged between the barber shop and a dry goods store. Eleanor pushed through the door and was immediately hit by the smell of coffee and frying meat. Most of the tables were full, ranchers, shopkeepers, the usual weekday crowd. She took a seat near the window and ordered the roast beef without looking at the menu. While she waited, she watched the street traffic and let her mind wander. That's when she saw him. A man stood across the street studying the notice board outside the sheriff's office. He was tall, lean in the way that spoke to hard miles and scarce meals. Dark hair touched with gray, weathered skin. He wore trail clothes, dusty jeans, a faded shirt, a coat that had seen better years. A bedroll and saddlebag sat at his feet. There was something about the way he held himself, a particular stillness that Eleanor recognized. She'd seen it in soldiers who'd come home from the war carrying more than they'd left with. Men who'd learned to be quiet because noise attracted trouble. He studied the notices with careful attention, reading each one thoroughly. Then he pulled one down, folded it, and tucked it into his pocket. Eleanor felt something stir in her chest. Curiosity, maybe, or instinct. The waitress brought her lunch, breaking her attention. When Eleanor looked back, the man was gone. She ate slowly, thinking. Then she paid, left a tip, and crossed the street to the notice board. Several papers fluttered in the breeze, advertisements for cattle auctions, a reward poster for a horse thief, a call for workers at the copper mine. And in the middle, the notice she'd posted 3 months ago. Challenge. Ride the unrideable. 10 minutes on Obsidian, Eleanor Vance's Black Stallion. Success earns $500 in ownership. Failure costs $50. Vance Ranch, west of Copper Ridge. The paper was weathered but still legible. Someone had taken it down to read, then put it back up. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, maybe, or just the shadow of it. She rode home as the afternoon stretched long and golden. When she reached the ranch, Miguel was waiting for her at the barn, his expression unreadable. "We've got a visitor," he said. "Who?" "Didn't give a name. Just showed up about an hour ago and asked about the challenge." Miguel paused. "He's different from the others." "Different how?" "Quieter. Older. Got the look of someone who's seen things." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Where is he?" "At the corral. Been standing there the whole time, just watching the horse." She found him exactly where Miguel said. Posted at the fence, both forearms resting on the top rail, utterly still. Up close, She could see the scars on his hands, the lines around his eyes. 40, maybe. Maybe older. Hard to tell with men who'd lived rough. "You're here about obsidian," Eleanor said. Not a question. The man glanced at her, and she saw his eyes were gray-blue, the color of winter sky. "Yes, ma'am. You got a name?" "Caleb Rourke." "You got $50, Mr. Rourke." "I do." "You understand you're probably going to lose it." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I understand that's what everyone thinks." Eleanor studied him. He didn't have the swagger of the Morton boy or the desperate hunger of the gamblers who'd tried before. He had something else entirely, a quality she couldn't quite name. "Why do you want to ride him?" she asked. Caleb looked back at the stallion. Obsidian had noticed them, and he stood at the far end of the corral, watching with the same intensity Caleb was watching him. "Because nobody else can," Caleb said finally, "and because something about that horse reminds me of something I've been looking for." "What's that?" He didn't answer right away, just kept watching the stallion with that peculiar stillness. "Proof," he said eventually, "that broken things can still choose to trust." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, like a locked door recognizing its key. "When do you want to try?" she asked. Caleb turned to look at her again, and this time she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Not today," he said. "Today I just want to watch him, get to know what I'm dealing with." Most men want to prove themselves right away. Most men fail right away too. Eleanor found herself almost smiling. "You can camp on the property if you need. There's a spring-fed creek about a quarter-mile south of the barn. Good water. Appreciate it." She left him there, standing at the fence while the sun sank lower and the shadows grew long. When she glanced back from the porch, he was still in the exact same position, watching Obsidian with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that some things couldn't be rushed. That night, Eleanor lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind and thinking about the stranger at her fence, about the way he'd looked at Obsidian, not as a challenge to overcome, but as a puzzle to understand, about what he'd said regarding broken things and trust. She thought about Daniel, gone 3 years now, but still present in every board of the barn he'd built, every fence post he'd driven, every memory that ambushed her when she wasn't paying attention. And she thought about herself, running a challenge she'd designed not to be won, but to be understood, waiting for someone who could see past the obvious test to the real question underneath. Could something that had been whole, then shattered, ever truly be whole again? Or was that just a story people told themselves to make loss bearable? Outside, under a sky dense with stars, Caleb Rourke sat by a small fire near the creek and thought about all the ways a man could fail at the thing he wanted most. He'd ridden a long way to reach this valley, following a rumor about an impossible horse and a widow who kept challenging men to try what couldn't be done. He'd spent the last 5 years drifting, working ranches from Montana to Texas, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Running from a past that followed him anyway, no matter how many miles he put between himself and the things he'd done, the things he'd failed to do. But something about that black stallion spoke to him. The way it moved, powerful but wary, capable but unwilling. The way it watched everything with those dark eyes, measuring, remembering. Caleb understood that wariness. He learned it the hard way. Through betrayals and losses that had taught him trust was a luxury for people who hadn't seen what he'd seen. But watching Obsidian tonight, seeing the intelligence in those eyes and the potential in that powerful body, Caleb felt something stir that he thought was dead. The belief that maybe, just maybe, broken could become whole again. If the right kind of patience was applied. If understanding replaced force. If trust could be earned instead of demanded. He poured the last of his coffee onto the fire and watched the embers hiss and die. Tomorrow, he'd start the real work. Not the 10-minute challenge, but the days or weeks of slow, careful approach that preceded it. The kind of work most men weren't willing to do because it required something harder than strength. It required admitting you didn't have all the answers. And Caleb Rourke, who'd spent 5 years running from his failures, was finally ready to stop pretending he did. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the valley in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Caleb had been the type to notice such things anymore. He wasn't. He'd learned to see mornings as nothing more than the start of another day's work, Another chance to fail or succeed at whatever small task kept him moving forward. He'd slept poorly, the way he always did in new places. Every sound registered: coyotes in the distance, cattle shifting in their pens, the creak of the windmill that needed oiling. Old habits from years when sleeping too deep could get you killed. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, he'd already washed in the creek, made coffee over a rekindled fire, and was standing at the corral fence again, watching Obsidian emerge from the shelter at the far end. The stallion moved like controlled thunder, each step deliberate. He'd noticed Caleb immediately, but showed no reaction beyond a slight shift in his ears. Not welcoming, not hostile, just aware. Caleb appreciated that. Awareness meant intelligence, and intelligence meant the horse was making choices, not just reacting on instinct. You couldn't fool intelligence. You had to earn its respect. "You're up early." He turned to find Eleanor approaching from the house, a steaming mug in her hands. She looked like she'd been awake for hours herself, hair already pinned up, work clothes on, boots dusty from some task she'd completed before most people opened their eyes. "Can't seem to sleep past sunrise anymore," Caleb said. "War does that to people." It wasn't a question. She'd spotted the particular quality of his watchfulness, the way his body had tensed slightly when she'd approached from his blind side. Caleb didn't bother denying it. "Among other things," he said. Eleanor came to stand beside him at the fence, and for a moment they both just watched the horse. Obsidian had moved closer, maybe curious about the two humans who weren't trying to do anything to him. "Most men who come here," Eleanor said, "they see that horse and immediately start planning their approach. How they'll rope him, how they'll mount, what technique they'll use. You've been standing here for almost 18 hours now, and you haven't done anything. That's because doing something would be the wrong move. How do you figure?" Caleb gestured toward Obsidian with his coffee cup. "Look at how he's positioned himself. Far enough away to feel safe, close enough to observe. He's not running because he's not threatened. The moment I step into that corral with a plan to ride him, I become a threat. Then all that intelligence you saw in him gets channeled into self-preservation." Eleanor studied him with eyes that missed nothing. "You sound like you've done this before." "Not exactly like this, but I've worked with difficult horses." He paused. "And difficult people. Same principle applies. You can't force trust. You can only create the conditions where trust becomes possible. And how do you do that? Time, patience, proving you're not a threat even when you could be." Caleb turned to look at her directly. "Your husband. How long did it take him to ride Obsidian?" Something flickered across Eleanor's face. Pain, maybe, or the memory of it. "1.5 years, give or take. But I'm guessing the actual riding part came somewhere in the middle of that time. The rest was just being present, letting the horse get used to him." "Daniel used to sit in the corral for hours," Eleanor said quietly. "Reading, sometimes. Or just thinking. People thought he was crazy wasting time like that, but he said you couldn't rush connection. Smart man." "He was." She took a sip of her coffee. "You planning to sit here for 1.5 years, Mr. Rourke?" "No, ma'am. I don't have that kind of time, and I suspect you don't have that kind of patience." Caleb watched Obsidian take a few steps closer, testing. "But I figure I can compress the timeline if I approach it right. Your husband had to teach that horse everything from scratch. Obsidian already knows how to trust. He just forgot it was safe to do so. I'm not building something new. I'm trying to remember something old." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, "You want breakfast? Can't rebuild trust on an empty stomach." Caleb followed her to the house, acutely aware he was crossing some invisible threshold. The porch steps creaked under his weight. The front door opened into a room that was clean but lived in, functional without any attempt at decoration. A widow's house, stripped of the small touches that made a place feel like a home instead of just shelter. The kitchen table was scarred oak, big enough for a family that didn't exist anymore. Eleanor gestured for him to sit while she moved around the stove with the efficiency of someone who'd cooked 10,000 meals and stopped thinking about the process years ago. "Coffee's fresh," she said, pouring him a cup without asking. "Or fresh enough?" "Appreciate it." She cracked eggs into a pan, sliced bread from a loaf that smelled homemade, and worked in silence until she set a plate in front of him loaded with more food than he'd eaten in a single sitting for months. "You always feed the men who come to challenge your horse?" Caleb asked. "No, most of them I wouldn't trust in my kitchen." Eleanor sat across from him with her own plate. But you're different. Different how? You're the first one who looked at Obsidian and saw a thinking creature instead of an obstacle to overcome. Caleb ate slowly, tasting actual flavor for the first time in recent memory. What happened to your husband, if you don't mind me asking? Eleanor's jaw tightened slightly. His horse spooked on the ridge trail, steep drop. They both went over. Daniel died on impact. The horse had to be put down. I'm sorry. 3 years ago this November. She pushed eggs around her plate. People keep telling me I should move on, sell the ranch, find someone else, as if grief had an expiration date and I'd somehow missed it. Grief doesn't expire, Caleb said quietly. It just changes shape, becomes part of the landscape you navigate instead of the storm that knocked you down. Eleanor looked at him sharply. You sound like you know. Lost my wife and daughter 8 years back. Fever took them both within a week of each other. The words came out flat, factual. He'd said them enough times that they'd lost their ability to cut, mostly. Spent a long time after that trying to outrun what that felt like. Finally figured out you can't outrun your own shadow. Is that why you're here? Still running? Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally trying to stand still long enough to figure out what comes next. They finished breakfast in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Eleanor collected the plates, and Caleb stood to help, but she waved him off. Go watch your horse, she said. I'll find you when I need you for something useful. Caleb returned to the corral and resumed his position at the fence. Obsidian had moved even closer during breakfast, maybe 20 yards away now instead of 40. Testing boundaries, measuring threat levels. Miguel appeared around mid-morning, leading a work crew to repair fence line on the north pasture. He stopped by the corral, studying Caleb with undisguised curiosity. You're the one who's been standing here since yesterday, Miguel said. That's right. Planning to just stand there until you take root? Planning to let the horse get used to me before I ask him for anything. Miguel grunted. Eleanor thinks you might actually understand what you're doing. Eleanor might be giving me too much credit. Doubt it. She's got good instincts about people. Miguel shifted his weight. Fair warning, if you're running some kind of con, planning to hurt that horse or take advantage of her hospitality, you'll answer to me. And I don't have her patience. Caleb met the foreman's eyes directly. No con. Just a man trying to do something difficult without making it worse. Miguel held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. All right then. There's tools in the barn if you want to make yourself useful between all this standing around. Eleanor won't say it, but she could use the help. Place is too big for her and me to handle alone. I'll keep that in mind. The work crew moved off toward the north pasture, and Caleb was alone again with the horse. He settled into the rhythm of watching, noting small details. The way Obsidian's ears tracked sounds across the valley. How he favored his left side when he turned. The pattern of his movements, restless in the morning, calmer as the sun climbed higher. Around noon, Eleanor brought him a sandwich and a canteen of water. You don't have to feed me again, Caleb said. I know. But you look like you've been surviving on jerky and hardtack for about 6 months, and I won't have people saying I let a man starve on my property. She sat on the fence rail, easier in her own skin than most women Caleb had known. There was a competence to her that reminded him of his wife, that particular strength that came from carrying weight without complaint. Tell me about Daniel and Obsidian, Caleb said. How did he do it? What was his approach? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, memory softening her features. He started by just existing in the same space. Wouldn't even look at Obsidian directly for the first few weeks. Just did chores in the corral, mucking stalls, repairing fence, whatever needed doing. Let the horse observe him without feeling observed. Building comfort through familiarity. Exactly. Then he started talking to him. Nothing important, just commentary on the weather, what he was working on, stories about his day. Daniel said horses respond to tone more than content. The sound of a calm human voice becomes associated with safety. Caleb watched Obsidian, who was now close enough that he could see the individual muscles shifting beneath the dark coat. When did he first touch him? Month 3, maybe? And even then it was barely a touch, just his hand extended, letting Obsidian come to him or not. Took another 2 weeks before the horse actually made contact. What changed? Eleanor smiled slightly. Daniel brought him apples, sat in the middle of the corral with a bucket full of them, eating one himself and leaving the rest within reach. Obsidian's curiosity finally overrode his caution. Food is a powerful motivator, for horses and men both. Eleanor slid down from the fence. I've got accounts to settle this afternoon. You need anything? Find Miguel. She left him with the sandwich and his thoughts. Caleb ate slowly, watching the way afternoon light changed the color of Obsidian's coat from pure black to something that held hints of deep blue. An hour later, he made his first move. He entered the corral slowly, no sudden movements, and sat down in the dirt about 15 feet from the fence, not approaching the horse, not even looking at him directly, just occupying space. Obsidian's head came up immediately, his whole body tensed, ready to bolt or fight depending on what Caleb did next. Caleb did nothing, just sat there, legs crossed, hands loose in his lap. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Obsidian remained frozen, every sense focused on the potential threat in his territory. Then Caleb started talking. I knew a horse like you once, he said, his voice low and even. Big buckskin gelding named Whiskey. Mean as hell when I first met him. Previous owner had beaten him for being stubborn, which only made him more stubborn. Obsidian's ears swiveled toward the sound, but his body stayed tense. Took me 4 months to convince Whiskey I wasn't going to hurt him. 4 months of sitting just like this, talking about nothing, proving I was boring instead of dangerous. Caleb picked up a piece of dried grass and studied it. Eventually he got curious, came over to sniff me, decided I wasn't worth the energy of hating, and after that we got along fine. The stallion took a tentative step forward, then stopped, reconsidering. You're smarter than Whiskey was, Caleb continued. I can see it in your eyes. You're not just reacting, you're thinking, calculating risk versus reward. That's good. That kind of intelligence kept you alive this long. Another step. Obsidian's nostrils flared, pulling in Caleb's scent from a distance. I'm not going to rush you, not going to force anything. Just going to sit here and let you make your own choices about whether I'm worth trusting. Caleb shifted slightly, deliberately making himself more comfortable. Because here's the thing. I know what it's like to have your world break apart, to lose something that made you feel safe and spend all your time after that just trying to survive instead of live. The words came easier than he expected, maybe because he was talking to a horse instead of a human, or maybe because some part of him needed to say them out loud. My wife was named Sarah. Daughter was Annie, 8 years old, all energy and questions. His throat tightened, but he pushed through. When they died, something in me died too. The part that believed in building toward tomorrow, instead of just enduring today. Obsidian had moved closer, drawn by the tone if not the content. He stood maybe 10 feet away now, head lowered slightly, still wary, but less defensive. I've been drifting ever since. Taking work that doesn't matter, moving before I get attached, keeping everything at arm's length because attachment meant risk, and risk meant loss. Caleb finally looked directly at the stallion. But standing here watching you yesterday, I recognize something. You're doing the same thing I am. Surviving instead of living. And that's no kind of life for either of us. The horse took another step. Then another. Close enough now that Caleb could see the individual hairs on his muzzle, the intelligence in those dark eyes. So here's what I'm thinking, Caleb said softly. Maybe we both try something different. Maybe we stop protecting ourselves from connection and see what happens when we take the risk. Obsidian stretched his neck out, nostrils flaring as he scented Caleb from 3 feet away. Every muscle in his body was still poised for flight, but he was choosing to stay, choosing to investigate instead of run. Caleb remained perfectly still, hardly breathing. Then Obsidian closed the final distance and pressed his nose against Caleb's shoulder. Just for a moment, just long enough to make contact. Then he wheeled and retreated to the far end of the corral, shaking his mane like he'd surprised himself. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline or emotion, hard to say which. Progress, he said to the empty air. He stayed in the corral for another hour, just sitting, before finally standing and letting himself out. His legs had gone stiff from holding the same position, and his back protested the movement. Miguel was working near the barn and had clearly been watching. That's more than anyone else has managed, he called out. It's a start, Caleb replied. Long way from riding. Still, Eleanor was right about you. Caleb found Eleanor in the ranch office, bent over a ledger with reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when he knocked on the doorframe. "How'd it go?" she asked. "He came close enough to touch me, then bolted. That's further than he's let anyone get in 3 years." Eleanor set down her pencil. "What did you do?" "Talk to him. About loss and fear and what it's like to protect yourself by refusing connection." Eleanor's expression shifted into something complicated. "You're either the best horseman I've ever met, or the most damaged man who's using my horse as therapy." "Probably both." She almost smiled. "There's a spare room in the bunkhouse if you want it, more comfortable than sleeping by the creek. I don't want to impose." "You're not. And if you're going to be working with Obsidian, you might as well be close." Eleanor stood, removing her glasses. "Besides, Miguel mentioned you know your way around ranch work. I could use someone who can fix things without needing constant instruction." "What needs fixing?" "Everything. The windmill's been making that noise for 6 months. Half the stalls need new boards. The tack room door won't close right. Fence line on the eastern pasture is a disaster." She ticked items off on her fingers. "I can pay you standard hand wages if you want to earn your keep while you're here." Caleb considered. He'd come here with a single purpose: ride the horse, prove something to himself, move on. But the idea of staying, of having work that mattered, and a place that wasn't just another stop on an endless road, pulled at something in his chest. "All right," he said. "I'll take the room and the work." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. "Bunkhouse is behind the barn. Pick whichever bed isn't covered in Miguel's stuff. Supper's at 6 if you want it." The bunkhouse was simple. 4 beds, a wood stove, a table, and chairs. Miguel's belongings occupied the bunk nearest the stove, so Caleb took the one by the window. He didn't have much to unpack. A spare shirt, some basic supplies, a photograph wrapped in oilcloth that he never looked at but couldn't throw away. He sat on the bed and felt the strangeness of being still, of choosing to stay instead of leave. It made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite name. That evening, he joined Eleanor and Miguel for supper at the main house. The meal was simple but substantial: stew and bread and coffee that could strip paint. They ate mostly in silence, the comfortable kind that came from people who didn't need to fill every gap with noise. "Caleb's taking the bunkhouse and some work," Eleanor told Miguel. The foreman nodded. "Good. Maybe you'll finally let me fix that windmill without climbing up there yourself and giving me heart failure." "I'm perfectly capable." "You're perfectly capable of breaking your neck," Miguel interrupted. "Let the man help." Eleanor shot him a look but didn't argue. Caleb sensed this was an old argument, worn smooth with repetition. After supper, he walked back to the bunkhouse under a sky brilliant with stars. The valley was quiet except for wind and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. He lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about Obsidian's brief touch, the way the horse had chosen to investigate instead of run, thinking about Eleanor's offer of work and what it meant to accept it, thinking about Sarah and Annie and whether they'd want him to keep punishing himself for surviving when they hadn't. Sleep came eventually, deeper than usual, and when he woke before dawn, he realized with some surprise that he'd slept through the night without waking once. The next week fell into a rhythm. Mornings, Caleb spent time in the corral with Obsidian, doing nothing more than existing in the same space, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, always talking, about his past, about the work he'd done, about nothing in particular. The horse grew gradually more comfortable, approaching closer each day, staying longer before retreating. Afternoons, Caleb worked on the ranch's endless maintenance needs. He fixed the windmill's bearing, replaced boards in the stalls, rehung the tack room door, and started the slow process of repairing the eastern fence line. The work felt good, purposeful in a way the last few years of drifting hadn't been. Eleanor watched his progress with both the horse and the ranch with a kind of quiet approval. She didn't hover or offer unnecessary instruction, just let him work, and occasionally brought him coffee or pointed out something that needed attention. Miguel thawed considerably once he saw Caleb could actually handle the work. They fell into an easy partnership, the foreman's knowledge of the ranch complementing Caleb's general competence. On the 8th day, Obsidian let Caleb touch him. It happened without fanfare. Caleb was sitting in the corral talking about some fence repair when the Stallion simply walked over and stood beside him, close enough that Caleb could have reached out and made contact. So he did. Slowly, telegraphing the movement, giving Obsidian every chance to retreat. His hand connected with the horse's shoulder, and Obsidian didn't bolt. Just stood there, accepting the touch, his skin warm and alive beneath Caleb's palm. "There you are," Caleb said softly. "There's the horse Daniel knew." He kept his hand there for maybe 30 seconds, just gentle pressure, before withdrawing. Obsidian stayed a moment longer, then moved away to crop at some grass, as if the contact had been no big deal. But it was a big deal. Caleb's heart was hammering, and his hands were shaking again with the weight of the breakthrough. Eleanor was walking back from the barn and must have seen what happened because she changed direction and came to the fence. "He let you touch him," she said. "Yeah. How does it feel?" Caleb thought about it. Like maybe broken things can remember what whole felt like. Eleanor's eyes glistened slightly, but she blinked it away. "Daniel would have liked you." "I would have liked him too, I think." They stood together at the fence, watching Obsidian graze in the afternoon sun, and Caleb felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight for years begin, very slowly, to unclench. That night at supper, Miguel raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To actual progress. About damn time something went right on this ranch. "Don't jinx it," Eleanor said, but she was smiling. Caleb smiled too, surprising himself. When was the last time he'd done that? Months, maybe. Longer. The conversation drifted to ranch business, cattle prices, a problem with one of the water tanks, plans for winter feed. Normal concerns of normal people living normal lives. Caleb listened and contributed where he could, feeling himself settle into the rhythm of it. After they finished, Eleanor lingered while Miguel headed back to the bunkhouse. "You're different than when you arrived," she observed. "How so?" "Less haunted, more present." She collected plates from the table. "Whatever you're finding here, I'm glad for it." "I'm finding that work and purpose help," Caleb said, "and that some horses are worth the patience." "Some horses?" Eleanor repeated. "Or some people?" He met her eyes and saw understanding there. "Both, maybe." She nodded, satisfied. "Get some rest. Tomorrow you should try putting a halter on him." "You think he's ready?" "I think if you wait until you're sure, you'll wait forever. Sometimes you just have to take the next step and trust it'll hold." Caleb thought about that as he walked back to the bunkhouse, about trust and next steps and the difference between recklessness and courage. The next morning, he stood in the corral with a halter in his hands and his heart in his throat. Obsidian approached as he had been doing, comfortable now with Caleb's presence. He let Caleb run a hand down his neck, scratch behind his ears, touch his muzzle. "We're going to try something new today," Caleb said quietly. "You're not going to like it at first, but I need you to trust me anyway." He showed the stallion the halter, letting him sniff it, investigate it. Then slowly, giving Obsidian every chance to object, he slipped it over the horse's nose. Obsidian's head came up sharply. He backed away, pulling against the unfamiliar pressure. Caleb held firm but gentle, maintaining contact. I know it feels wrong, but you're safe. I promise you're safe." The stallion danced sideways, testing the restraint. His eyes showed white, and every instinct was clearly screaming at him to fight or flee. But Caleb kept talking, kept his hand steady, kept his body language calm. And gradually, painfully gradually, Obsidian stopped fighting, stopped pulling, just stood there, trembling slightly, accepting the halter. "Good boy," Caleb breathed. "That's it. You're all right." He kept the halter on for maybe 2 minutes before removing it, rewarding the trust with relief. Obsidian shook his head hard once it was off, then looked at Caleb as if reassessing everything he thought he knew. "Tomorrow we'll try again," Caleb said, "and the day after that, until you understand that accepting help doesn't mean giving up freedom." Eleanor was watching from the fence, and when Caleb let himself out of the corral, she was smiling in a way that transformed her whole face. "That was beautiful," she said. "That was terrifying." Same thing, sometimes. Over the next few days, the halter work progressed. Each session lasted longer. Obsidian fought less. The trust that had been building found a framework to settle into. Caleb started leading him around the corral, teaching him to respond to pressure and release. The stallion learned quickly, his intelligence making the work easier once he understood what was being asked. But there were setbacks, too. Days when Obsidian refused to cooperate, when something spooked him, and all the progress seemed to evaporate. Days when Caleb's patience wore thin and he had to walk away before frustration ruined what they'd built. Eleanor helped during those moments, appearing with coffee or a comment that gave him perspective. Miguel offered encouragement in his gruff way, acknowledging the difficulty of what Caleb was attempting. And slowly, steadily, the work continued. 2 weeks after Caleb first arrived at the ranch, Patricia showed up for her weekly visit with Thomas trailing behind her. Eleanor's daughter-in-law was exactly the type of woman Caleb had learned to avoid. Sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, with opinions about everything and flexibility about nothing. She took one look at Caleb working in the corral with Obsidian and made a small disapproving sound. "Mother Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Who is that man, and why is he playing with Daniel's horse?" Eleanor straightened from the fence she'd been mending. "His name is Caleb Rourke. He's working on the ranch and attempting the challenge." The challenge? Patricia's tone suggested what she thought of that. How many men have tried that ridiculous challenge now? 20, 30, 32. And you think this one will be different? I think this one understands what the challenge actually is. Patricia exchanged a look with Thomas, who had the grace to appear uncomfortable. He was a softer version of his father, lacking Daniel's quiet strength but carrying some of his kindness. "Mother," Thomas said carefully, "we've been talking, and we really think it's time to consider selling," Eleanor finished. "I know. You mention it every week. Because it makes sense," Patricia interjected. "You can't run this place alone, and hiring drifters off the road isn't a solution." Caleb could hear the entire exchange from the corral. He kept working with Obsidian, but his jaw tightened. "Caleb's not a drifter," Eleanor said, her voice hardening. "He's a skilled horseman and a competent ranch hand. And this is still my ranch, which means I'll decide what makes sense." "For how long?" Patricia pressed. "You're not getting younger, and this place is falling apart." "That's enough." The command in Eleanor's voice cut through Patricia's momentum. She stood straighter, and Caleb recognized the steel that had kept this ranch running for 3 years against all the pressure to give up. "Thomas, Patricia, I appreciate your concern. I always do. But I'm not selling. Not this year, not next year, not until I decide I'm ready. Is that clear?" Thomas nodded quickly. Patricia's mouth compressed into a thin line, but she managed a stiff nod as well. They left shortly after, Patricia's disapproval radiating like heat. Eleanor watched their wagon disappear down the valley road, her shoulders tight with tension. Caleb finished with Obsidian and joined her at the fence. "Family's complicated," he offered. "Family's exhausting." Eleanor rubbed her temples. "She means well. They both do. But they see this ranch as a burden I'm too stubborn to release instead of a life I'm choosing to live." "You don't owe them explanations." "I know, doesn't make it easier." She glanced at him. "How'd it go today?" "Good. He's accepting the halter without much fuss now, responding to lead pressure. I think in another week or 2, we can try a saddle blanket." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "That fast?" "He remembers being ridden. We're not teaching him something new. We're reminding him it's safe to allow it again." Caleb paused. "But I need to be honest with you. The 10-minute ride you're asking for, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Getting to that point is going to take time." "How much time?" "Months, maybe. If I rush it, I'll undo everything we've built." Eleanor considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right. Then we change the terms. No more 10-minute challenge. You work with him properly, and when both of you are ready, you ride him, however long that takes." "You do that?" The challenge was never really about 10 minutes. It was about finding someone who understood that trust can't be forced. She met his eyes. "You've already proven that. The rest is just details." Caleb felt something settle in his chest. Relief? Maybe. Or gratitude. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You're still going to be here through winter, and winters in this valley are brutal." He smiled. "I've survived worse." "I believe you have." That night, the first real cold front of the season swept down from the mountains, bringing temperatures that made breath visible and turned the water in the horse troughs to ice by morning. Caleb woke to find frost covering the bunkhouse window in intricate patterns, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Miguel was already up, feeding the wood stove. "Welcome to Valley Winter," he said. "Hope you brought warmer clothes." "I didn't. Eleanor keeps spare gear in the tack room. Daniel's stuff mostly. She won't say it, but she'd rather see it used than gathering dust." Caleb found the clothes where Miguel said they'd be. Heavy canvas work jacket, wool-lined gloves, a hat with ear flaps that would have looked ridiculous if function mattered more than fashion. Everything fit well enough. Daniel had been a similar build, apparently. Wearing a dead man's clothes should have felt strange, but instead it felt like borrowing tools. Practical, necessary. Nothing more complicated than that. The cold changed the rhythm of the ranch work. Tasks that had been uncomfortable became genuinely difficult. Fence posts that needed replacing were frozen into ground hard as concrete. Water lines had to be checked constantly to prevent freezing. The animals needed more feed, more attention, more of everything just to maintain themselves through the dropping temperatures. Obsidian grew a thicker coat, his black hair taking on a shaggier texture that made him look even more imposing. But the cold seemed to make him more amenable to Caleb's presence. Maybe the warmth of human contact registered differently when the world turned harsh. They'd progressed to the saddle blanket, as Caleb had predicted. The first time he laid it across Obsidian's back, the stallion had tensed but didn't bolt, just stood there, quivering slightly, accepting this new imposition the way he'd learned to accept the halter. "Good boy," Caleb murmured, smoothing the blanket into place. "See? Nothing to fear." He left it on for 5 minutes, then removed it. Tomorrow they'd try 10 minutes, then 15. Building tolerance through repetition until the blanket became as unremarkable as Caleb's presence. Eleanor watched these sessions when her other work allowed. She rarely commented, just observed with that sharp attention that missed nothing. Caleb found himself increasingly aware of her presence, the way she moved through the world with competence and conviction. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 45, though the years of hard work had added lines that might have come later under easier circumstances. Handsome rather than beautiful, with the kind of face that reflected character more than delicate features. He caught himself watching her sometimes when he should have been focused on the horse. The way she handled a difficult piece of equipment without hesitation. The rare smile that transformed her serious expression into something warmer. The particular set of her shoulders when she was determined about something. It made him uncomfortable, this awareness. He hadn't looked at a woman with anything beyond passing notice since Sarah died. Hadn't wanted to. But Eleanor Vance was getting under his defenses without even trying, and he didn't quite know what to do about it. Miguel noticed, of course. The foreman didn't miss much. "You're staring," he said one afternoon while they were repairing a section of barn roof that had started leaking. "Was thinking about the fence repair," Caleb lied. "Sure you were." Miguel hammered a nail with more force than necessary. "Eleanor's a good woman. Deserves better than what this valley's offered her since Daniel died. I'm aware. Just making sure you know what you're looking at." Caleb set down his hammer and met Miguel's eyes directly. "I'm looking at my employer and someone I respect. That's all. For now, maybe." Miguel's expression was unreadable. "But things change. People change. Just remember she's been through enough without someone adding complications she doesn't need." Understood. They worked in silence after that, but Caleb felt the weight of the warning. Miguel was protective of Eleanor, and rightly so. She'd earned loyalty through the way she treated people and the strength she showed in keeping the ranch running against all the pressure to quit. The last thing she needed was a drifter with more past than future developing feelings that couldn't go anywhere good. But feelings, Caleb was discovering, didn't much care about logic. 3 weeks into his stay, the first snow fell. Not the light dusting that melted by noon, but the real thing. Heavy flakes that accumulated fast and transformed the valley into something from a painting. Beautiful and treacherous. The ranch work shifted into winter mode entirely. Everything took twice as long and required 3 times the effort. Caleb fell into bed each night exhausted in ways that felt clean, honest, the kind of tired that came from useful work rather than pointless motion. His sessions with Obsidian had to be adjusted for the weather. The corral became slippery with ice and snow, dangerous for both man and horse. So Caleb moved their work to the barn, using the main aisle as a training ground. The enclosed space changed the dynamic. Obsidian seemed more relaxed inside, away from the wind and cold. Or maybe he'd just reached a point where Caleb's presence meant safety instead of threat. They'd graduated to a saddle now, Not the fancy show saddle that hung in the tack room, but a working saddle worn smooth with years of use. Daniel's saddle, Eleanor had told him, the one he'd used on Obsidian before. The first time Caleb set it on the stallion's back, Obsidian's ears went back. His whole body tensed, but he didn't move, didn't try to shake it off or bolt, just stood there, remembering what this meant. "You know this, don't you?" Caleb said quietly, cinching the girth with careful pressure. "You remember being ridden. Remember what it felt like when someone you trusted was up there." Obsidian turned his head to look at Caleb, and something in those dark eyes made Caleb's chest tighten. Recognition, maybe, or grief for what had been lost. He left the saddle on for an hour that first day, just letting Obsidian wear it while Caleb went about other barn chores. By the end of the week, the stallion barely reacted when the saddle appeared. Eleanor found Caleb in the barn one evening after the day's work was done. Snow was falling again outside, muffling sound and turning the world into shades of white and gray. "He looks good," she said, nodding toward Obsidian in his stall. "He's coming along. More than that, he looks like himself again, the horse Daniel knew." She stepped closer to the stall, and Obsidian moved to her immediately, pressing his nose against her hand. "I'd forgotten what that looked like. You visit him much?" "Not as much as I should." Eleanor's voice went quiet. "It hurt too much for a while. Looking at him was like looking at everything I'd lost. And now? Now it feels like maybe I'm getting something back." She glanced at Caleb. "You've done good work here, better than I expected when you first showed up." "The horse did most of it. I just created space for him to remember. Don't sell yourself short. What you've done takes skill and patience and something else I can't quite name." "Stubbornness?" She smiled. "That too. But I was thinking more like recognition. You understood what he needed because you needed the same thing." Caleb didn't know how to respond to that, so he just stood there while Eleanor scratched behind Obsidian's ears with the familiarity of long practice. "Miguel says you're the best hand he's worked with in years," she continued. "Says you anticipate problems before they become problems and fix things right the first time." "Miguel's being generous." "Miguel doesn't do generous, he does honest." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "I want to offer you permanent work, not just until you ride Obsidian, but after. However long you want to stay." The offer landed like something physical. Caleb felt it in his chest, his throat, behind his eyes. "Eleanor, the pay's fair, the work's steady, and you'd have a place here that's yours. Not much, but more than drifting offers." She held his gaze. "I know you've been running from something. Most people who end up at the edge of the valley are. But maybe it's time to stop running and see what staying looks like." Caleb wanted to say yes, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him. But old habits died hard, and the instinct to protect himself by refusing attachment was strong. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course. Take whatever time you need." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes dimmed slightly. Disappointment, maybe, or just acceptance of a familiar answer. "Offer stands regardless." She left him in the barn with his thoughts and a decision that felt heavier than it should. That night, alone in the bunkhouse while Miguel was at the main house settling accounts with Eleanor, Caleb pulled out the photograph he kept wrapped in oilcloth. He hadn't looked at it since arriving at the ranch, hadn't needed the reminder of what he'd lost because it was always there anyway, a weight he carried in his chest. Sarah smiled at him from the faded image, Annie on her lap. They were sitting on the porch of the house they'd rented in Wyoming, before the fever, before everything ended. Happy. Whole. Gone. He studied their faces, trying to remember what their voices sounded like. Sarah's laugh, Annie's endless questions, the small details that time wore away no matter how hard you tried to hold them. "I don't know what to do," he said to the photograph. "I don't know if staying is honoring your memory or betraying it." The photograph offered no answers. It never did. He wrapped it carefully and put it away, then lay in the dark trying to imagine what permanent felt like. What it would mean to stop moving, stop running, stop protecting himself from connection. The idea terrified him. But it also pulled at something deep in his chest, some part of him that remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere. To build toward tomorrow instead of just surviving today. He fell asleep without reaching a decision, and his dreams were full of black horses and women with serious eyes, and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Miguel burst into the bunkhouse before dawn, his face tight with worry. "Caleb, get up. We've got a problem." Caleb was on his feet instantly, the old soldier's reflexes kicking in. "What's wrong?" "Storm moved in during the night. Heavy snow. The cattle in the north pasture are stranded and the fence line's down. If we don't get them moved to shelter, we'll lose half the herd to exposure." They dressed fast and met Eleanor at the barn. She was already saddling her mare, her movements sharp with urgency. "How bad?" Caleb asked. "Bad? Maybe 30 head trapped up there, and the temperature's still dropping." Eleanor swung into the saddle. "Miguel, you take the east approach. Caleb, you're with me on the west. We need to push them toward the lower pasture where there's shelter." They rode out into conditions that were genuinely dangerous. The snow was still falling, thick enough to reduce visibility to maybe 20 yards. Wind cut through layers of clothing and made breathing feel like inhaling knives. The north pasture sat on higher ground, exposed to the worst of the weather. By the time they reached it, Caleb's face was numb, and his hands ached despite the gloves. The cattle were clustered against the downed fence, lowing miserably. Snow had already accumulated on their backs, and several of the younger animals looked close to foundering. "We split them!" Eleanor shouted over the wind. "Push them south toward the gap in the ridge. Miguel will meet us there." They worked in brutal conditions, using their horses to herd the reluctant cattle away from the fence and toward safety. The animals didn't want to move, didn't understand that staying meant dying. Caleb and Eleanor had to push them, force them, sometimes physically block them from turning back. An hour passed. Then 2. Caleb lost feeling in his feet. His face felt like it belonged to someone else. But they kept working because stopping wasn't an option. They'd moved maybe 20 head when Eleanor's mare hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. The horse went down hard, throwing Eleanor from the saddle. Caleb was off his own horse before he consciously decided to move. He reached Eleanor in seconds, helping her to her feet while her mare scrambled up, limping. "You all right?" he demanded. "Fine, just bruised." She was limping too, favoring her left leg. The mare's hurt worse. The horse wouldn't put weight on her right foreleg. Not broken, maybe, but badly strained. She wasn't carrying Eleanor anywhere. "Can you ride?" Eleanor asked, nodding toward Caleb's gelding. "Yes, but then you keep pushing the cattle. I'll walk out with the mare. We can't lose these animals." "The hell I will." Caleb's voice came out harder than he intended. "You're hurt, the temperature's dropping, and walking in this weather could kill you both." "We don't have a choice." "We do." Caleb looked back toward the ranch, calculating distances. "Obsidian." Eleanor stared at him. "You can't be serious. You said yourself he's ready, or close enough." Caleb was already moving toward his horse. "I'll ride back, get him saddled, and bring him up. We can both ride out, push the cattle faster with 2 mounted." "Caleb, you haven't ridden him yet. Not even once. Asking him to do this, in these conditions, is risky. I know." He swung into his saddle. "But leaving you here is riskier, and those cattle need help now, not in 3 hours when Miguel realizes something's wrong." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She knew he was right. "Be careful," she said instead. "If he fights you, then I'll deal with it." Caleb gathered his reins. "Keep moving if you can. I'll be back as fast as possible." He pushed the gelding into a run, racing the weather and his own doubts back toward the ranch. The barn was cold and dim when he burst through the doors. Obsidian was in his stall, ears pricked at the sudden noise. Caleb didn't have time for gradual approach. He grabbed the saddle and bridle, moving with purpose. "I know this isn't how we planned it," he said, entering the stall. "I know you're not ready, and I'm not ready, and this is exactly the kind of mistake that ruins everything we've built." He threw the blanket over Obsidian's back. The stallion tensed but held still. "But Eleanor's hurt and stranded, and I need you to trust me one more time, just this once. We'll figure out the rest later." The saddle went on. Obsidian's ears flattened, and Caleb could feel the tension radiating through the horse's body. But he didn't bolt, didn't fight. The bridle was harder. Obsidian tossed his head, resisting the bit. But Caleb persisted, his hands steady despite the urgency singing through his veins, and finally the stallion accepted it. "Good boy, that's it. We're going to do this together." He led Obsidian out of the stall and into the barn aisle. The stallion moved skittishly, aware that something was different, something was wrong. At the mounting block, Caleb paused. This was the moment. The test that had drawn him here in the first place. Everything he'd worked for condensed into a single choice. He put his foot in the stirrup. Obsidian's whole body went rigid. Easy, Caleb said. Easy now. He swung his other leg over and settled into the saddle. For one breathless moment, nothing happened. Obsidian stood frozen, every muscle locked. Caleb could feel the stallion's heart hammering, could sense the war between instinct and trust happening in the animal's mind. Then Obsidian moved, not exploding in fury, not bucking or rearing or any of the things Caleb had braced for, just walking. One step, then another, uncertain but willing. That's it, Caleb breathed. Just like that, you remember. You know how this works. He guided Obsidian toward the barn doors and out into the storm. The stallion balked at the weather, but Caleb urged him forward with legs and voice, asking for trust where force would have failed. They moved from walk to trot, then to a controlled canter. Obsidian responded to the bit and rein with the memory of old training, his intelligence filling the gaps where recent practice was lacking. The ride to the north pasture took half the time Caleb's gelding had needed. Obsidian moved with power and purpose, eating up ground with a stride that spoke to the quality Daniel had seen in him years ago. When Eleanor came into view, limping along with her mare, her face transformed with shock and something else. Hope. Maybe. Or wonder. You rode him, she said as Caleb pulled Obsidian to a halt beside her. Had to. Caleb dismounted, his legs shaking slightly from adrenaline and cold. How's the leg? I'll live. How's he handling it? Better than I expected. Caleb ran a hand down Obsidian's neck. The stallion was breathing hard but calm, accepting the situation with remarkable composure. But we need to move. Can you ride? With help. Caleb boosted Eleanor into Obsidian's saddle, then swung up behind her. It wasn't ideal. The stallion had never carried double, and Eleanor's injured mare complicated things further, but they were out of options. Let's go, Eleanor said, gathering the reins. We've still got cattle to save. Together they worked the remaining animals toward safety, Eleanor handling Obsidian while Caleb managed the logistics from behind her. The stallion responded to her commands with only slight hesitation, as if remembering old patterns of trust. Miguel met them at the ridge gap with the rest of the cattle. His eyes widened when he saw Eleanor and Caleb on Obsidian together, but he was professional enough not to comment. There'd be time for questions later. They pushed the combined herd down to the lower pasture where shelter and feed waited. By the time the last animal was secured, the light was failing and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, all three of them too cold and exhausted for conversation. Eleanor's mare limped along behind them, and Obsidian carried his double burden without complaint, the powerful muscles beneath the saddle working like machinery designed for exactly this purpose. At the barn, Caleb helped Eleanor down first, then dismounted himself. His whole body ached and his hands were so numb he could barely feel the reins. But they'd made it, all of them. Get inside and warm up, Miguel ordered Eleanor. I'll handle the horses. I can help. No, you can't. Your leg's swelling and you're half frozen. Miguel's tone left no room for argument. Caleb and I have this. Go. Eleanor limped toward the house, throwing one last look back at Obsidian. The stallion watched her go, calm and patient in the crossties. Caleb and Miguel worked in companionable silence, untacking the horses and rubbing them down with warm towels. Obsidian accepted the care without fuss, as if carrying two people through a blizzard was just another day's work. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen, Miguel said finally. Probably both. He could have killed you. First time riding him and you ask him to do that? Didn't have a choice. Caleb finished with Obsidian and moved to Eleanor's injured mare. Eleanor needed help. He was the answer. Miguel studied him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. You care about her. It wasn't a question. I respect her, Caleb said carefully. That's not what I said. Caleb didn't answer, just focused on wrapping the mare's strained leg, giving it something to do that wasn't meeting Miguel's knowing gaze. She cares about you too, Miguel continued. In case you're wondering, talks about your work with the horse, mentions your good help, smiles more when you're around. Miguel, I'm not warning you off, not anymore. The foreman's expression was serious. I'm just telling you what I see, so you can make informed decisions about what comes next. What came next was supper in Eleanor's kitchen, all three of them wrapped in blankets and drinking coffee strong enough to strip enamel. Eleanor's leg was propped up, swollen but not broken. Miguel had checked it with the practiced hands of someone who dealt with plenty of ranch injuries. Tomorrow I'll ride to Copper Ridge for the doctor, Miguel said. Make sure it's nothing serious. It's fine, just a bad sprain. You'll see the doctor anyway. They ate stew that Miguel had warmed up, and the conversation stayed carefully away from what had happened that afternoon. Nobody wanted to examine it too closely yet. The emotions were too raw, the implications too significant. But when Miguel excused himself to check on something in the barn, Eleanor and Caleb were left alone in the kitchen with the weight of unspoken things filling the space between them. You rode him, Eleanor said finally. I did, in the worst possible conditions, without any preparation beyond training that hadn't included actual riding. Yeah, that was reckless. It was necessary. Eleanor shook her head, but she was almost smiling. Daniel would have said the same thing. He had this way of making the impossible sound reasonable. I'm not Daniel. No, you're not. She met his eyes. You're Caleb Rourke, and you rode an unrideable horse to save me and my cattle without hesitating, without counting the cost. The cost was acceptable. To who? If Obsidian had thrown you, if you'd been hurt or killed, but I wasn't. Caleb leaned forward. Eleanor, I knew the risk. I chose to take it because some things are worth risking everything for. The words hung in the air between them, meaning more than just the horse. Eleanor's expression shifted into something complicated. The offer I made, about permanent work. Do you have an answer? Caleb thought about the photograph in his pocket, about Sarah and Annie and the life he'd lost, about the 8 years he'd spent running from attachment because attachment meant risk and risk meant potential loss. And he thought about this afternoon, riding through a blizzard on a horse that had every reason not to trust him, racing to help a woman who'd become more than just an employer. Yes, he said, I'll stay. Eleanor's whole face transformed. You will? If the offer's still open, it is. It absolutely is. She stood, forgetting about her injured leg, and had to grab the table for balance. Caleb was there in a moment, steadying her. They were close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that the space between them felt charged with possibility. Caleb, she said softly. Eleanor, I should tell you, I need you to know. Whatever she was going to say got cut off by Miguel returning, stomping snow off his boots and bringing cold air with him. The moment broke. Eleanor stepped back, and Caleb let his hands fall away. Everything settled? Miguel asked, oblivious. Everything's fine, Eleanor said. Caleb's accepted my offer. He's staying on permanent. Miguel's face split into a genuine smile. About damn time. Welcome to the family, Rourke. Family. The word hit Caleb in the chest with unexpected force. He hadn't been part of a family in 8 years, hadn't let himself want that. But standing in Eleanor's kitchen with snow falling outside and warmth filling the room, he realized he'd somehow stumbled into exactly what he'd been running from. Connection. Belonging. Home. And for the first time since Sarah and Annie died, he wasn't afraid of it. Winter deepened its grip on the valley over the following weeks, turning the world into something stark and unforgiving. The snow that had nearly killed Eleanor's cattle became a permanent fixture, piling in drifts that reached the fence rails and made every task twice as difficult. But inside the pattern of ranch life, something had shifted. Caleb no longer felt like a visitor passing through. He had a place here now, a role that extended beyond temporary work. The bunkhouse became his space, not just borrowed shelter. The rhythm of morning chores and evening meals settled into his bones the way habits do when you stop fighting them. And Obsidian, the horse that had started this whole journey, continued to remember what it meant to trust. Caleb rode him every day now, weather permitting. Short sessions at first, just walking circles in the barn or the near pasture. Then longer rides as the stallion's confidence rebuilt itself. They worked together on basic commands, on responding to leg pressure and rein cues, on the 1,000 small communications that turned two separate beings into a functional partnership. It wasn't smooth. Some days Obsidian balked or spooked at nothing, all the old defensive patterns surging back. Caleb would have to dismount and start over, rebuild the trust from scratch, prove again that patience mattered more than force. Eleanor watched these sessions when her injured leg allowed. The doctor from Copper Ridge had confirmed it was just a bad sprain, but recovery was slow. She moved carefully, favoring the leg, her independence chafing against the forced limitation. "You're pushing too hard," Caleb told her one morning when he found her trying to carry feed buckets one-handed while using a crutch. "Someone has to do the work." "That's what Miguel and I are here for." He took the bucket from her. "You hired help. Let us help." Eleanor's jaw tightened with frustration, but she didn't argue. Just stood there looking like a woman who'd spent 3 years proving she didn't need anyone and resented the injury that said otherwise. "I'm not good at being useless," she said finally. "You're not useless. You're healing." Caleb set the bucket down. "And there's a difference between accepting help and being weak. Took me years to learn that." "What changed?" "I got tired of carrying everything alone. Realized it wasn't strength. It was stubbornness pretending to be strength." Eleanor studied him with those sharp eyes. "You're talking about more than ranch work." "Maybe." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sarah and Annie, you said they died 8 years ago." "Yes." "Did you let anyone help you through that?" Caleb's chest tightened. "No, I pushed everyone away. Thought grief was something you had to face alone or it proved you didn't love them enough. And now? Now I think I was wrong. Think I wasted years running when I should have been standing still long enough to heal." He met her eyes. "Think the people who loved me would have wanted better for me than what I chose." Eleanor's expression softened into something that made Caleb's heart kick harder. "I think they would have too." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither was quite ready to say. Then Miguel's voice called from the barn, breaking the spell. "Caleb, need you on the fence line." Eleanor stepped back, the distance feeling deliberate. "Go. Miguel doesn't ask unless it's important." Caleb went, but the conversation stayed with him through the day's work. The way Eleanor had looked at him, the things implied but not spoken, the sense that something was building between them that neither fully understood yet. That evening, Thomas and Patricia showed up unannounced, their wagon struggling through the snow-packed road. Patricia looked even more pinched than usual, her disapproval radiating before she'd even climbed down. "Mother Eleanor," she said, her tone suggesting she'd been practicing this conversation. "We heard about your accident. Sprained leg. Hardly worth the trip out here in this weather. We were worried." Thomas's concern seemed genuine, at least. "The doctor said you need to stay off it for weeks." "I'm managing." Patricia's eyes swept the yard, landing on Caleb as he led Obsidian back from an evening ride. "With help from your hired man, I see." The way she said it made hired man sound like something distasteful. Eleanor's voice went cold. "Caleb saved my life and 30 head of cattle during the storm. I'd appreciate you speaking of him with respect." "Of course." Patricia's smile was thin. "I'm sure he's very capable. But, Mother Eleanor, you must see this only proves what we've been saying. The ranch is too much for you to handle alone." "I'm not alone. I have Miguel. I have Caleb now. Hired help isn't family." Patricia moved closer, her voice taking on a wheedling quality. "Thomas and I have been discussing it. The Mortons have made another offer. A generous one. Enough for you to buy a lovely house in Copper Ridge and live comfortably without all this struggle." "I've told you. I'm not selling." "But why not? What are you holding on to? Daniel's been gone 3 years. This ranch, that horse, they're just reminders of what you've lost." Eleanor's face went white. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut. "Get out." "Mother, I said get out, both of you." Thomas looked stricken. "We're only trying to help. By telling me to abandon everything Daniel and I built? By treating his memory like it's something to be sold off to the Mortons?" Eleanor's hands were shaking. "This ranch isn't a reminder of loss. It's proof that what we built together matters, that I matter. And I won't give that up because it makes you uncomfortable." Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but Thomas grabbed her arm. "We should go before the road gets worse." They left in stiff silence, Patricia's expression promising this conversation wasn't over. Caleb watched from the barn doorway, staying out of sight but ready to intervene if needed. When the wagon disappeared, Eleanor sagged against the porch railing. Caleb approached carefully. You all right? No, her voice cracked. But I will be. Want to talk about it? Want to pretend it didn't happen? Caleb understood that impulse. Can I offer an alternative? What's that? Come have coffee. Let yourself be angry instead of pretending you're fine. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. They went inside and Caleb made coffee while Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her injured leg propped up. They mean well, she said finally. That's the worst part. They genuinely think they're helping. People often do the most damage with good intentions. Patricia sees me as this tragic figure, poor widow clinging to the past, too stubborn to accept reality. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. And maybe she's right. Maybe I am just holding on because letting go feels like betrayal. Or maybe you're holding on because this place matters to you, because the work you do here has value beyond profit. Caleb sat across from her. There's no virtue in giving up something you love just because other people can't understand why you love it. Is that what you did? With your life after Sarah and Annie? The question hit harder than she probably intended. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. I gave up everything, he said finally. Sold the house, left the town, walked away from anyone who'd known me before. Thought starting over meant erasing the past. But you can't erase what shaped you. I just carried it with me in a different form. Do you regret it? Regret wasting 8 years? Yes. Regret the time I took to figure out what I actually needed? No. He met her eyes. Sometimes the long way around is the only way we learn the lesson. Eleanor's expression was complicated. And what did you learn? That running from grief doesn't heal it. That connection matters more than safety. That broken things choosing to trust again, that's not weakness. It's the bravest thing there is. The words hung between them, meaning more than their surface suggested. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. Caleb, I need to tell you something. All right, when I started the challenge with Obsidian, I wasn't really looking for someone to ride him. I was looking for proof that what Daniel and I had, that quality of partnership, that depth of understanding, still existed somewhere, that it hadn't died with him. I know. You do? Figured it out pretty quick. The challenge was never about 10 minutes. It was about finding someone who understood that trust is built, not taken. Eleanor's eyes glistened. And then you showed up, this quiet, damaged man who looked at that horse and saw exactly what I saw. Who had the patience and the pain to understand what real connection costs. Eleanor, let me finish. She took a breath. I've been alone for 3 years. By choice, mostly. Couldn't imagine letting anyone close enough to matter because losing Daniel nearly destroyed me. Better to be alone than risk that kind of loss again. Caleb's heart was hammering. He knew where this was going and didn't know if he was ready. But watching you work with Obsidian, Eleanor continued, watching you rebuild yourself while helping him heal, it made me think maybe I was wrong. Maybe shutting everyone out isn't protection. Maybe it's just another kind of dying. What are you saying? I'm saying I care about you, more than I should, more than is probably wise given you've only been here a few months. Her voice was steady now, committed. And I think you care about me too. But we're both so damn scared of what that means that we're dancing around it instead of being honest. Caleb should have expected this. Probably had, on some level. But hearing it said out loud made it real in a way that terrified him. You're right, he said. I do care about you. And that scares the hell out of me. Why? Because caring means risk, means opening myself up to the possibility of loss again. And I barely survived it the first time. I know. Eleanor's expression was gentle. I'm terrified too, but I'm more afraid of spending another 3 years alone because I was too scared to try. What if I'm not ready? What if I hurt you because I'm still caring too much? Then we'll figure it out, together. She reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of his. I'm not asking for promises, Caleb. I'm just asking if you're willing to try. He looked at her hand, so close to his own. Thought about Sarah and Annie, about whether loving someone new meant betraying their memory. Thought about the last 8 years of running and the loneliness that had become so familiar he'd mistaken it for normal. And he thought about Obsidian, a horse that had every reason to refuse trust but chose it anyway. Chose connection over safety, chose to risk being hurt again because the alternative was being alone. Caleb reached out and took Eleanor's hand. Her fingers closed around his, warm and real, and here. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen, just holding hands across the table. And something in Caleb's chest that had been clenched tight for 8 years finally, slowly, began to open. "I can't promise I won't be difficult," he said. "I'm counting on difficult. Difficult I can handle. And I can't promise I've figured everything out." "Nobody has. We'll stumble through it like everyone else." He smiled despite himself. "When did you get so wise?" 3 years of forced solitude. Gives you time to think." Eleanor's thumb traced small circles on the back of his hand. "So, are we doing this? Whatever this is?" "I think we are. If you're patient with me. I waited 3 years for someone to understand that horse. I think I can be patient with the man who finally did." They finished their coffee still holding hands, talking about easier things. Ranch business, Miguel's upcoming birthday, whether the winter would break early or late. But underneath the mundane conversation was the awareness of what had shifted between them. The acknowledgement that they were choosing to try, despite the fear. When Eleanor finally stood to head upstairs, Caleb walked her to the base of the steps. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For being brave enough to stay. For seeing me as more than just the widow running a failing ranch. You're not failing, and you're definitely more than just—" She kissed him. Just a brief press of lips, there and gone, before he could properly register it. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eleanor." He walked back to the bunkhouse in a daze, his mind spinning. Miguel was already asleep, snoring softly from his bunk. Caleb lay in the dark and touched his lips, still feeling the ghost of Eleanor's kiss. This was real. This was happening, and he was terrified and hopeful in equal measure. The next few weeks brought a subtle shift in the ranch's atmosphere. Nothing dramatic. Caleb and Eleanor were both too private for grand gestures. But small things changed. The way they stood a little closer when working together. How Eleanor's hand would brush his shoulder in passing. The looks that lasted a moment longer than necessary. Miguel noticed, of course. He cornered Caleb in the barn one morning with a knowing smirk. "You two finally figure it out?" "Figure what out? Don't play dumb, it doesn't suit you." Miguel crossed his arms. "I've been watching you dance around each other for weeks. Glad you both came to your senses." "It's complicated." "Love usually is." Miguel's expression turned serious. "But Eleanor deserves happiness, and you deserve a second chance. Don't overthink it to death." Easier said than done. Most worthwhile things are. The work with Obsidian continued to progress. Caleb could now ride him anywhere on the ranch without incident. The Stallion had remembered not just the mechanics of being ridden, but the partnership that made it worthwhile. They moved together with increasing fluency, horse and rider communicating through pressure and balance, and something that felt close to understanding. One clear afternoon, Eleanor asked to ride with them. Her leg had healed enough that the doctor had cleared her for light activity. "You sure?" Caleb asked. "I want to. Haven't ridden since the accident, and I'm tired of being cautious." He saddled Eleanor's mare. The one that had been injured was still recovering, and his own gelding, leaving Obsidian for himself. They rode out to the South Ridge, where the view stretched across the entire valley. The land was beautiful in the way winter landscapes could be. Harsh, but honest. The snow caught the afternoon light and turned everything gold and blue and white. The air was so cold it burned to breathe, but the sun on their faces held the promise of spring still months away. They stopped at the ridge crest, letting the horses rest while they took in the view. "Daniel proposed to me right here," Eleanor said quietly. 23 years ago this spring." Caleb didn't say anything, just listened. "We were both so young. I was 19, as he was 22. Everyone said we were too young, that we should wait. But Daniel said when you know something's right, waiting doesn't make it more right. Just makes you older." He sounds like he was a good man. He was. Not perfect, nobody is. But good, kind, patient. Eleanor turned to look at Caleb. "I loved him completely. Still do, in a way, but that doesn't mean I can't love someone else too. Took me a long time to understand that." "What changed?" "You did. The way you worked with Obsidian showed me that healing isn't about forgetting what came before. It's about integrating it, letting the past inform the present without controlling it. Caleb felt the weight of that. I'm still figuring that out myself. Then we'll figure it out together. They rode back as the sun started setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and orange. When they reached the barn, Caleb helped Eleanor dismount, and she leaned into him for a moment, just resting against his chest. "This is good," she said. "Us. This." "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "It is. That night, Eleanor invited him to supper in the main house. Just the two of them. Miguel had made himself scarce with unusual tact. They ate and talked about everything and nothing. Eleanor told stories about Daniel, about the early years of the ranch, about her son Thomas, and the complicated love she had for him despite Patricia's interference. Caleb talked about Sarah and Annie, found that speaking their names didn't hurt quite as much as it used to. "Do you think they'd approve?" Eleanor asked. "Sarah and Daniel, I mean. Of us." Caleb considered it honestly. "I think Sarah would want me to be happy. Wouldn't care how I got there as long as I did. Daniel would say the same about me." Eleanor stood and began clearing plates. "He used to say that love isn't a limited resource, that caring for someone new doesn't diminish what you felt before." Smart man. He had his moments. They washed dishes together, the domestic intimacy of it striking Caleb as both comfortable and significant. This was what partnership looked like in the quiet moments. Not grand gestures, just shared tasks and easy silence. When the kitchen was clean, Eleanor walked him to the door. They stood on the porch under a sky brilliant with stars, breath misting in the cold. "Stay," Eleanor said softly. Caleb's heart kicked. "Eleanor, not for that. Not yet." Her cheeks colored slightly. "Just stay. Talk with me. Let me fall asleep knowing you're nearby." So he stayed. They sat in the living room with the fire burning low, Eleanor curled in one chair and Caleb in another. They talked until her words started slurring with exhaustion. Then Caleb draped a blanket over her and banked the fire. He should have left then. Gone back to the bunkhouse and his own bed. But something kept him there, watching Eleanor sleep in the firelight, her face peaceful in a way he'd rarely seen during waking hours. "I think I'm falling for you," he whispered to her sleeping form, "and that's terrifying. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the terrifying things are the ones worth doing." He left before dawn, before Eleanor woke. But when he returned for breakfast, she smiled at him in a way that suggested she knew he'd stayed, that it mattered. February arrived with more snow and temperatures that made November's cold seem mild by comparison. The ranch work became a battle against the elements. Water lines froze despite precautions. Animals needed constant monitoring. Equipment broke in ways that required creative fixing because sending to Copper Ridge for parts meant waiting weeks. But through it all, Caleb felt something building inside him that had nothing to do with the weather, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of waking up each morning with reasons that mattered. He'd stopped thinking about moving on, stopped seeing his time at the ranch as temporary. This was home now, in a way nowhere had been since Sarah and Annie died. And Eleanor. Eleanor was becoming something he hadn't expected. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely her own. A partner who understood loss without being defined by it. A woman with strength enough to be vulnerable and wisdom enough to know the difference. They hadn't talked about the future, hadn't defined what they were to each other beyond the growing certainty that they mattered. But Caleb found himself thinking about it anyway, about what it would mean to fully commit, to stop holding part of himself in reserve against potential loss. One evening in late February, Eleanor found him in the barn working on a piece of tack that had broken. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Always." She sat on a hay bale, her expression serious. "The Mortons made another offer, higher than before. Thomas brought it by this afternoon." Caleb's hand stilled. "Are you considering it?" "No. But I wanted to talk to you before I turned them down definitively." "Why?" "Because you're part of this now, part of the ranch, part of my life. And if I'm going to fight to keep this place, I need to know you're fighting with me." Caleb set down the tack and gave her his full attention. "Eleanor, I'm not going anywhere. I told you I'd stay and I meant it. Even if it gets harder, even if the Mortons push back or Patricia makes things difficult or the ranch struggles. Especially then." She nodded, satisfied. "Good. Because I'm done being pushed, done letting other people define what my life should look like. Her expression turned fierce. This ranch is mine. This choice is mine. And I'm choosing to keep it. Then we'll make it work. We will. Eleanor stood and crossed to him. Together, she kissed him then, properly this time. Not a brief brush of lips, but something deeper, a claiming that left them both breathless. When they broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. I didn't plan to. Didn't think I could again. But I do. Eleanor's eyes were bright. I love you too. Even though you're stubborn and damaged and terrible at asking for help. That's a hell of a declaration. I'm a practical woman. Figured you should know what you're getting into. He laughed, actually laughed, and pulled her close. They stood like that in the quiet barn with Obsidian watching from his stall and the winter wind howling outside, and Caleb felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Not for some distant future, but for tomorrow. For the day after that. For the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that built into a life worth living. Spring came late to the valley that year, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow retreated in grudging increments, revealing mud and dead grass and all the damage the cold had inflicted. Fences sagged where frost heave had shifted posts. The barn roof had new leaks from ice damage. Equipment that had worked fine in November refused to start in March. But the light changed. That was the first real sign. The sun climbed higher each day, lingering longer, touching the land with warmth that actually penetrated instead of just decorating the surface. Birds returned. The creek ice broke up with sounds like gunshots echoing across the valley, and the cattle, winter lean and tired, began to show renewed energy as the grass started thinking about growing again. Caleb stood at the corral fence one morning in early April, watching Obsidian run for the simple joy of movement. The stallion had shed his heavy winter coat, and his black hide gleamed in the sunlight, every muscle visible beneath the skin. He looked like what he was, powerful, intelligent, whole. He's beautiful, Eleanor said, appearing beside Caleb with 2 cups of coffee. He is. Caleb accepted the cup. Hard to believe he's the same horse I met 6 months ago. Hard to believe you're the same man. Caleb glanced at her. Eleanor was smiling, and the expression transformed her face the way it always did. She'd changed too over the winter. The constant tension in her shoulders had eased. She laughed more. The lines around her eyes came from smiling now instead of worrying. I'm not sure I am, he admitted. Good. The man who showed up here was running from everything. The man standing here now is running toward something. Toward you. Toward us. Toward a life that matters. She leaned against him, comfortable with the casual contact in a way that still surprised Caleb sometimes. Miguel says the fence line repair can wait another week if you want to take Obsidian out on a real ride. Test what you've built. Where would we go? Anywhere. Everywhere. That's the point. Eleanor turned to face him properly. You've done the work, Caleb. You've earned the horse's trust and your own peace. Now ride somewhere that isn't a circle in a corral. See what that feels like. So that afternoon, Caleb saddled Obsidian and pointed him toward the South Ridge Trail, the one that led up into the higher country where Daniel had died. He hadn't asked Eleanor if it was all right to go there. Somehow he knew it was. The ride up was everything Caleb had hoped it would be. Obsidian moved with confidence and power, navigating the rocky trail without hesitation. When they reached the ridge top, Caleb dismounted and let the stallion graze while he took in the view. The entire valley spread below them. Eleanor's ranch looked small from up here, the buildings like toys arranged on a quilt of brown and green. Beyond it, other ranches dotted the landscape. Copper Ridge was just visible to the east, smoke from its chimneys rising straight up in the still air. And farther out, the mountains still wore their winter white, reminding everyone that the seasons turned but never truly left. Your husband died somewhere near here, Caleb said to Obsidian, who'd moved closer to investigate. Eleanor told me about it. Said his horse spooked, and they both went over. The stallion's ears flicked toward the sound of his voice. I've been thinking about that. About how one moment of bad luck can end everything you've built. How fragile it all is. Caleb ran a hand down Obsidian's neck. But I've also been thinking about how you don't honor the dead by refusing to live. You honor them by taking the gifts they gave you and building something with them. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of warming earth and distant rain. Caleb thought about Sarah and Annie, about the life they'd shared and the years he'd wasted afterward pretending he could outrun grief. I loved them, he said out loud. I always will. But I love Eleanor too, and I'm choosing to believe that's not betrayal. That the heart has room for both the past and the future if you let it. He mounted again and rode the ridgeline for another hour, pushing Obsidian into a run along the flat sections, feeling the power and freedom of the horse beneath him. This was what Daniel had known, what Eleanor had been waiting for someone else to understand. Not dominance, but partnership. Not breaking, but building. When they returned to the ranch, Eleanor was waiting at the barn. One look at Caleb's face told her everything she needed to know. How was it? She asked anyway. Perfect. He was perfect. Caleb dismounted and started untacking. Responded to everything I asked, trusted me completely. And you? How did you feel? Caleb paused, searching for the right words. Free. For the first time in 8 years, I felt free. Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she was smiling. Good. That's what Daniel would have wanted, for both of you. That evening, they had supper at the main house, Caleb, Eleanor, and Miguel. It had become a routine over the winter, the three of them sharing meals and conversation like the family they'd accidentally become. I've been thinking, Miguel said, pushing his empty plate away. About retiring. Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. What? Not immediately, but soon. Next year, maybe. Miguel looked uncomfortable with the attention. I'm getting old, Eleanor. The work's getting harder. And with Caleb here now, permanent-like, you don't need me the way you used to. That's not true. It is true. And it's all right. Miguel's expression was gentle. I've given this ranch 30 years. Watched you grow up, watched you marry Daniel, watched you become the woman you are. I'm proud of all of it. But I'm tired. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, what would you do? I've got a sister in Santa Fe. She's been asking me to come stay with her, help her run a small trading post she bought. He smiled slightly. Might be nice to sell things instead of fix them for a change. You'd leave the valley? The valley will be fine without me. You'll be fine without me. You've got Caleb now, and I suspect that's going to become more official before too long. Caleb and Eleanor exchanged a glance. They hadn't talked about marriage, hadn't put words to what everyone could see developing between them, but Miguel's knowing look suggested he'd already drawn his own conclusions. We haven't, Eleanor started. You will, Miguel interrupted. And when you do, I want to know this place is in good hands, that Eleanor's not alone, that the ranch Daniel built will continue. He looked at Caleb. You love her? Yes. You planning to stay? Yes. Then that's all I need to know. Miguel stood, collecting plates. I'll stay through spring planting and summer work. Help with the transition. But come fall, I'm heading south. After he left for the bunkhouse, Eleanor and Caleb sat in the living room with the weight of change settling around them. He's right, you know, Eleanor said quietly. About us. About what's coming. Is that what you want? For this to become more official? I want you. However that looks. She turned to face him. But I also want to be honest about what that means. This ranch will never make us rich. The work is hard and endless. People like Patricia will always be pressuring me to sell. It's not an easy life. I stopped looking for easy the day I rode into this valley. And if I asked you to marry me? To make this partnership legal and permanent? Caleb's heart stuttered. Are you asking? Eleanor's expression was serious. Not yet, but I'm thinking about it, and I want to know if you'd say yes. He didn't need to think about his answer. I would, without hesitation. Even though we've only known each other 6 months? Daniel told you when something's right. Waiting doesn't make it more right, just makes you older. Caleb reached for her hand. This is right, Eleanor. Us. The ranch, all of it. She kissed him then, and it felt like sealing a promise they hadn't quite made yet, but both knew was coming. The next few weeks brought the full arrival of spring. The valley turned green with shocking speed, grass pushing up through the mud, trees budding out, wildflowers appearing in unexpected places. The cattle were moved to summer pasture. Equipment was serviced and repaired. The endless cycle of ranch work shifted into its warmer weather rhythm. Thomas showed up one afternoon without Patricia, which was unusual enough that Eleanor immediately went on alert. "Is something wrong?" she asked as he climbed down from his wagon. "No, I just wanted to talk without—" He paused. "Without my wife managing the conversation." They sat on the porch while Caleb made himself scarce in the barn, though Eleanor had asked him to stay close. "I owe you an apology," Thomas said, "for Patricia's behavior, for my own. We've been pushing you to sell when what you needed was support." Eleanor studied her son. He looked tired, older than his 30 years. "What changed?" "I've been watching you this winter, watching how you've handled everything. And I realized you're happy, Mother. Happier than you've been since Dad died. This ranch, Caleb, the work, it's not a burden you're clinging to. It's a life you've chosen." "It is." Patricia doesn't understand that. She sees it differently. But I do. Thomas met her eyes. "I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner, for letting her speak to you the way she has." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest loosen. "Thank you. That means more than you know. Caleb seems like a good man." "He is. Dad would have approved, I think." Eleanor's eyes burned. "I think so too." Thomas left with better feeling between them than had existed in months. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching his wagon disappear, and felt Caleb's presence behind her before he spoke. "That sounded like it went well," he said. "Better than I expected." She turned to face him. "He gave us his blessing. Not that we needed it, but it's nice to have." "Does this mean you're ready to ask me that question?" Eleanor smiled. "Maybe. Are you ready to answer it?" "I already told you I would." "That was hypothetical. This would be real." "The answer doesn't change based on timing, Eleanor." She took a breath, visibly gathering courage. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a ring. Not fancy, just a simple silver band that had clearly been worn for years. "This was Daniel's," she said. "He wore it every day of our marriage, and I want you to have it. Not as a replacement for him, but as a continuation. A promise that love doesn't end just because circumstances change." Caleb's throat tightened. "Eleanor, will you marry me, Caleb Rourke? Will you be my partner in this ranch, this life, this future we're building together?" He took the ring from her, feeling the weight of what it represented. History and hope, past and future, loss and love intertwined in ways that couldn't be separated. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely yes." She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. "Good, because I wasn't sure what I'd do if you said no. You could have asked in a more traditional way. Most women expect the man to propose." "I'm not most women." "No," Caleb agreed, sliding the ring onto his finger where it fit perfectly. "You're definitely not." They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Miguel stood up for Caleb. Thomas and his wife attended, Patricia managing to be civil if not warm. A few neighbors came, and the circuit preacher who passed through the valley once a month performed the service in the living room of Eleanor's house. Their house now. Caleb was still getting used to that. The ceremony was short and honest. Eleanor wore a simple dress the color of sage, and Caleb wore his best shirt with Daniel's ring catching the light. They spoke vows they'd written themselves, promising partnership and patience, love and loyalty, honesty even when it was difficult. When the preacher said they could kiss, Caleb pulled Eleanor close and felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. This was home. This was family. This was the life he'd stopped believing he could have. The celebration afterward was modest, food and music and neighbors who were genuinely happy for them. Miguel played a guitar Caleb hadn't known he owned, and several people danced in the yard despite the mud. As evening approached and guests began drifting away, Caleb found himself at the corral fence watching Obsidian. The stallion had been curious about all the activity but had settled back into grazing, unconcerned with human celebrations. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Eleanor asked, joining him. "Thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago I was drifting, no purpose, no place, no connection to anything. Now I'm married to an incredible woman, I've got a home, and I helped heal a horse everyone said was broken beyond repair. The horse wasn't the only broken thing that got healed." Caleb pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "No, I suppose not." They stood like that as the sun set, painting the valley in gold and crimson. Behind them, their house glowed with lamplight. Miguel's guitar music drifted out, joined by voices singing an old song about love and loss and finding your way home. "I want to show you something," Eleanor said suddenly. She led him to the barn, to the tack room where saddles hung in neat rows. But instead of stopping there, she continued to the back corner where a trunk sat covered in dust. "I haven't opened this since Daniel died," she said, kneeling beside it. "Couldn't bring myself to, but I think it's time." Inside were Daniel's personal belongings. His good hat, a watch that had stopped working, letters Eleanor had written him during their courtship, a photograph of them on their wedding day, both of them impossibly young and bright with hope. At the bottom of the trunk was a leather journal. "He kept this the last year of his life," Eleanor said, opening it carefully. "Wrote in it every night. Thoughts about the ranch, about his work with Obsidian, about us." She paged through until she found what she was looking for, then handed the journal to Caleb. The entry was dated 2 months before Daniel's death. The handwriting was careful, precise. "Worked with Obsidian today on the Ridge Trail. He's finally trusting enough to handle the difficult terrain. It took 2 years to get here, but it was worth every moment of patience. Eleanor says I'm crazy to spend so much time on one horse, but she doesn't understand what I'm really doing. I'm not just training him to be ridden. I'm proving that trust can be rebuilt after it's been broken. That connection matters more than control. That the hard way, the slow way, is sometimes the only way that lasts. I hope when I'm gone, someone will remember this. Will understand that the work of healing, whether it's a horse or a person, can't be rushed. That patience is its own kind of courage. That choosing to trust again after being hurt is the bravest thing any living creature can do." Caleb read the passage twice, his vision blurring. Daniel had understood exactly what Caleb had needed to learn, had left instructions without knowing who would need them. "He would have liked you," Eleanor said softly. "Would have recognized what you and Obsidian were doing because he did the same thing himself. I wish I could have known him." "In a way you do. You followed the same path he did, learned the same lessons, built the same kind of trust." She closed the journal gently. "That's his legacy. Not just the ranch or the horse, but the understanding that healing takes time and patience and the courage to be vulnerable." They returned the journal to the trunk and went back outside where the party was winding down. Miguel caught Caleb's eye and raised his glass in a toast that spoke volumes without words. The last guests left as full darkness fell. Caleb and Eleanor stood on the porch of their house, and it was their house now, not just Eleanor's, and looked out at the ranch spread before them. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked. "That I spent 8 years running from connection because I was afraid of loss. Afraid that loving someone new meant betraying the people I'd already loved. But I was wrong." Caleb turned to face her. "Love doesn't diminish when you share it. It multiplies. Sarah and Annie would want me to be happy. Daniel would want the same for you, and we honor them not by staying frozen in grief, but by living fully in spite of it. That's very wise. I had good teachers, a widow who refused to give up on something she believed in, a horse that remembered how to trust, a foreman who saw potential where others saw a drifter." He kissed her forehead. "And a woman brave enough to ask a damaged man to marry her." Eleanor laughed. "We're both damaged. That's what makes us work. We understand each other's scars." They went inside together, into their shared home, into their shared future. And for the first time in longer than Caleb could remember, he didn't think about tomorrow with dread or yesterday with regret. He just existed in the present moment, grateful for what he'd found and determined to build on it. Summer came in full force, bringing long days and hard work and the satisfaction of watching things grow. Caleb and Eleanor fell into the rhythm of partnership, discovering each other's strengths and weaknesses, learning how to work together through disagreements and difficulties. It wasn't perfect. Some days they argued about ranch decisions. Some nights old grief rose up unexpectedly and needed to be weathered together. Some mornings were harder than others, the weight of memory pressing down like physical force, but they faced it together. That made all the difference. Miguel prepared for his departure as summer turned toward fall. He trained Caleb on the details of ranch management that only years of experience could teach. He showed Eleanor how to maintain the accounting books, passed along his knowledge of the valley's weather patterns, and grazing cycles and the 1,000 small details that kept a ranch running. "You'll be fine without me," he kept saying, though his eyes sometimes went distant with what he was leaving behind. "We'll miss you terribly," Eleanor always replied. But you deserve this. You've earned it. The day Miguel left was harder than anyone wanted to admit. They stood in the yard beside his packed wagon, all three of them struggling with emotions too large for words. You take care of her, Miguel told Caleb, gripping his hand hard. I will. And you take care of him, Miguel said to Eleanor. He acts tough, but he's softer than he thinks. I know. Miguel pulled them both into a hug that lasted longer than any of them expected. When he finally climbed into his wagon and snapped the reins, Caleb and Eleanor stood together watching until he disappeared around the bend in the road. End of an era, Eleanor said quietly. Beginning of a new one, Caleb replied. They turned back to the ranch, their ranch, and got to work. The months that followed tested them in ways both expected and unexpected. A late summer drought stressed the water supply. Several head of cattle were lost to illness despite their best efforts. The roof leak in the barn got worse before they could afford to fix it properly. Equipment broke at the worst possible times, but they handled it, together. And through it all, Obsidian remained a constant presence. Caleb rode him almost daily, the horse now responding with the kind of partnership that only years of trust could build. They worked cattle together, checked fence lines, rode for the simple pleasure of movement. The Stallion had become what Eleanor always knew he could be, not just rideable, but reliable. Not broken and remade, but healed and whole. One evening in late October, almost exactly a year after Caleb had first arrived, he and Eleanor sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The air carried the first real bite of coming winter, a reminder that the cycle was beginning again. You know what I realized today? Eleanor said. What's that? A year ago, I was alone except for Miguel, convinced the ranch would eventually break me, waiting for proof that the kind of partnership I'd had with Daniel still existed somewhere. And now? Now I have you. I have us. I have proof that broken things can heal if given patience and care. She leaned against him. And I have hope again. Real hope. Not just the stubborn refusal to give up. Caleb thought about that. About how much had changed in a single year. How he'd arrived at this ranch running from everything and found everything he'd been running toward. I've been thinking about something Daniel wrote, he said. About how choosing to trust after being hurt is the bravest thing any creature can do. I remember that passage. He was right. About Obsidian, about people, about everything. Caleb turned to look at Eleanor. You took a chance on a stranger who showed up with nothing but patience and pain. You offered me not just work, but a place in your life. That took courage. You took a chance, too, on me, on the ranch, on believing that maybe running wasn't the answer anymore. So we both chose trust over safety. And look where it got us. Eleanor gestured at the ranch spread before them, at the life they'd built together. Sometimes the risky choice is the right one. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead. From the barn came the sound of Obsidian moving in his stall, settling for the night. The familiar sounds of the ranch surrounded them, cattle lowing in the distance, the windmill creaking, the wind rustling through dying grass. This was home. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. Caleb thought about the journey that had brought him here. About Sarah and Annie, who taught him what love felt like. About the 8 years of running that had eventually led him to this valley, this woman, this life. About a black stallion that had needed someone patient enough to understand that healing couldn't be forced. And he thought about what he'd learned through all of it, that grief didn't have to be permanent, that broken things could choose to trust again, that the heart had room for both past and present if you were brave enough to let it, that running from pain didn't heal it, standing still and facing it did. Most importantly, he'd learned that starting over didn't mean erasing what came before. It meant integrating it, taking the lessons, the scars, the memories, and building something new that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. What are you thinking about? Eleanor asked, pulling him from his thoughts. About how lucky I am. How different my life would be if I'd never seen that notice in Copper Ridge. You would have kept drifting, probably, until I ran out of places to run or reasons to keep going. And now? Now I have more reasons to stay than I could count. He kissed the top of her head. You gave me that. This ranch, Obsidian, the work, it all gave me back something I thought was gone forever. What's that? Purpose. Connection. A reason to build toward tomorrow instead of just surviving today. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then, I should thank you too, for seeing past the challenge to what I was really asking, for having the patience to do the work right instead of taking shortcuts, for proving that Daniel's way, the slow way, the trust way, still matters. We saved each other, Caleb said simply. You, me, and a horse that reminded us both what it means to take the risk of trusting again. Winter's first snow began falling as they sat there, soft flakes drifting down through the darkness. Inside, their house waited warm and bright. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and the endless demands of ranch life. But tonight, there was just this. Two people who'd both been broken, both been alone, both been convinced the best parts of life were behind them, sitting together and proving themselves wrong. The snow accumulated on the porch railing, on the yard, on the distant pastures where cattle huddled against the cold. But Caleb and Eleanor stayed outside a while longer, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. I love you, Eleanor said finally. I love you too. Even though I'm stubborn and difficult and refuse to sell this impossible ranch, especially because of those things, she smiled, and even in the darkness he could feel the warmth of it. They stood together and went inside, into their home, into their shared life. Behind them, in the barn, Obsidian settled into sleep, safe and content and whole. The black stallion that everyone had said was unrideable, the widow who everyone had said should give up, the drifter who everyone would have said was too broken to heal. Together they'd proven that the impossible was just another word for difficult, that trust could be rebuilt after it shattered. That choosing connection over safety, patience over force, vulnerability over protection, these weren't weaknesses. They were the bravest choices any living thing could make. And in making them, all three had found what they'd been searching for. Not perfection, not easy answers, not freedom from pain or loss or difficulty, but home, purpose, partnership, and the quiet knowledge that broken things choosing to trust again weren't weak or foolish. They were simply brave enough to believe that healing was possible. And in that belief, in that choice, in that daily recommitment to connection despite its risks, they found something worth more than safety. They found life. Real life. The kind built not in spite of scars, but because of them. The kind that understood loss and chose love anyway. The kind that knew tomorrow wasn't guaranteed but showed up for it regardless. And in the end, that was the only kind of life worth living.